I'd like to call this committee of the whole to order, and I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Inkla-Katmuks and Syilx people. And we'll move right into new business, and I'm going to turn this over to you, Greg. This is your show.
Thank you very much, Your Worship, Council, for allowing us to provide you some flood mitigation options. Over the past few months, we've had our team together from the recovery operations side, everything from finance to liaison communications, the support center that's been around, and our housing options. Finally, for today, you'll get our presentation from our operations chief, the critical infrastructure portion of this, and what they've been working on and doing to present to you today with the flood mitigation options. So I'll pass it over to Darcy Horman, our chief.
So, Your Worship.
Oh, let me turn, yep. You got to turn your, yep, you need that. It flashes and I turn it on for you. There you are.
All right. Your Worship and Council, what we have here, pleased to present this body of work. Again, this is preliminary. I say again, this is very preliminary work. It's really a conceptual plan or plans, really options at this stage. There's been no decisions have been made. And before, essentially, we'll take this conceptual model, we'll incorporate the feedback from this session as well as from the information session that'll begin this afternoon or this evening at 6:30, and that will form essentially our funding proposal. We'll seek funding and take that to move into the detailed design and at some point further engagement and construction. So again, this is very preliminary, and without any further ado, I will pass it over to Greg and Paul. So Greg here is with Associated Engineering, and Paul Egg behind me is the project manager for this project, but they'll be walking us through essentially a community recovery flood mitigation planning session. So Greg, over to you, please.
Okay.
Jeff.
Greg,
Your Worship and Council, my name is Jeff Cahill. I'm a Senior Water Resources Engineer with Associated Engineering. And for the last few months, we've been working on this flood mitigation planning with the city, and we're here to present a little bit about what we've worked on and get into presentation of some of the conceptual options that we're looking at. So today I just want to quickly go over some preliminary information. So a very quick review of what happened November 2021, look at what our project objectives are and our current scope of work. Really want to talk a little bit about funding because that's going to be a key part of this, getting into the implementation of this plan. And then lastly, we'll talk specifically about the flood mitigation planning and the conceptual options that we've been developing. So November 2021, I'm sure you all remember this very well. There's an atmospheric river event that came through and had severe impacts in Merritt and many other regions as well. So atmospheric rivers, they're long, narrow streams of essentially really moist water, and that moisture is generated from the tropical regions. And this is nothing really new. There's been past events, but this one just had the right combination of conditions to have a severe impact on the Coldwater River. What that led to is, or I guess I should say, there is a Water Survey of Canada measurement gauge at the Main Street Bridge here in Merritt. And what I'm showing here is one of the early graphs that the Water Survey produced or published. And what I just want to highlight here is that there's been some uncertainty in that flow rate since November 15th. And I'll just add that there's been recent study and new information, and right now we're just looking for confirmation from Water Survey of Canada on what their measurement was from that event before we can make that part of our analysis.
So are we assuming it might be 400 cubic meters per second?
That there's a recent study from BGC Engineering which is supporting something in that range, and that was the original published value from Water Survey. But since that time, they've reduced their estimate. We've reached out to them to try and find out a little bit more information. We haven't had a response, but all I can say right now is that that's not their final data. So in the future, they will be updating that.
Thank you.
So I was on the ground helping Merritt in November and December with the emergency response, specifically looking at repairs to diking systems and other areas of bank protection and flood protection. So I did have the opportunity to see a lot of the results firsthand, and been able now to take this project to this stage looking at the conceptual options. So right now I'm standing in this particular photo where a dike used to be. So this is just downstream of Main Street where that dike avulsion, or the river channel avulsion, and the dike failure occurred, looking towards the properties that were damaged on Pine Street. Similarly, just downstream of here, we can see in the foreground there's a number of utilities and pieces of information that are, oh, a little bit of a delay there, sorry about that. Yeah, so we can see some utilities and infrastructure damages, because this, my photo here, I would have actually been standing right on where Pine Street used to be. Just waiting for this to, sorry, there's a little bit of an online lag, I think. So even further downstream towards the confluence with the Nicola, that avulsion channel exposed the FortisBC gas main. So this is a critical piece of infrastructure that supplies gas to the entire city. So there was risks associated with that exposure. FortisBC had to come in and do some emergency work. We provided some support and advice on that as well. Next photo that will come up in a second is the, yeah, I think I have to. So this is the end of Canford Avenue. This is also one of the severely hit areas, so substantial amounts of road damage. There's vehicle damages and properties impacted in this particular area as well. Next photo I'll show is the Middlesbrough Bridge, which is currently being looked at for replacement. So again, another severe consequence of that flood event. And then I'll just share a couple quick photos of some of the emergency works that were ongoing back in November, December. So here you can see a piece of equipment working on dike reconstruction. And related to that, we also had emergency bank repairs ongoing at that same time at numerous locations in the city. And then lastly, a good photo here of some of the resources that were employed during that emergency response. So the fire department and the Canadian Army there putting together one of the HESCO baskets for flood protection. So just a quick summary of some of those impacts. So you're obviously all aware of this, but there was widespread overland flooding in the city. There was damages to the water and wastewater systems. There was dike failures, bank erosion. Obviously, there was the bridge collapse. There was extensive damage to properties and buildings, temporary loss of services to the community, and there was an incredible amount of effort put into the emergency response, which I was fortunate to be a part of. And that all led to, obviously, right after November 15th, that evacuation order for the entire city of Merritt. So just some of our project objectives that we've talked about internally and with the city team. So we want a flood mitigation plan that's going to be robust. We want to have robust flood protection for the future and reduce future flood-related risks in the city. We want to have low capital costs and low operation and maintenance costs. I think the operation and maintenance component is a big consideration, because this is going to be a large piece of infrastructure that the city owns permanently in the city. We want to limit impacts to property as well as to the environment by building this new infrastructure. We want to maintain river access and provide opportunities for recreation. So I'll touch on this in a second, but there was a public survey that we put out, and this particular point on providing access and maintaining that recreation opportunity is something that the community definitely values. We want to develop a plan that considers the ease of implementation. So this really is all about constructability. We want something that is easy to build as well as easy to own and maintain. And then where feasible, it would be also important for us to be able to provide room for the rivers if it makes sense in some locations. So as I said, we put out a public survey. There was 315 respondents, which may not sound like a lot, but when we do these types of things, it's actually a pretty good response rate. So I think we had 8 or 10 questions, but there's only a few of them here that we'll just highlight because we think they're the important ones. So we asked, Is access to the Coldwater and Nicola Rivers important to you? So this was a pretty overwhelming response of yes. So 84% of the respondents said that providing that access is important to them. We asked, which of the following recreational uses of the Coldwater and Nicola Rivers do you value most? So they were asked to pick one, and the highest ranking selection was providing out of water recreation. So this would be, you know, that linear piece of infrastructure, that active transportation component that could be used for the residents. Number 4, which of the following natural features of the Coldwater and Nicola Rivers do you value most? So again, we asked people to pick one. So the highest ranking was actually habitat, or wildlife habitat along the rivers, followed by providing a scenery or a nice view, and then just maintaining a natural shoreline was the third choice. Number 5, which of the following activities do you enjoy along the city's existing dike system? So in this particular question, people could have responded by selecting a number of options. So the highest ranked ones here, so overwhelmingly it was running and walking, followed by wildlife viewing, and then cycling. Question 6 was, how could the access to the Coldwater and Nicola Rivers be improved? So there's a number of different options here, but designated swimming areas was an interesting response that people really wanted access to. So in the hot summers, obviously that's something that people value.
And there used to be several swimming holes throughout the life of Merritt. There was always, growing up, there was always a swimming hole somewhere, several places.
I think this is the last one that we're sharing. So question 7, so what type of river channel would you prefer on the Nicola and Coldwater rivers? So they had 3 options. They could do channelized or engineered dike system, have more of a natural channel, or some people chose either, or basically had no preference. So not a big spread in these results, but the channelized and engineered dike was the highest ranked. So just very quickly on our particular scope of work. So we had 2 parts. So we were looking at funding. So DMAF is an acronym for Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. That's through Infrastructure Canada, and I'll talk about that just in a second. But then very much related to that is flood mitigation planning. That's what we want to talk to you about today. So this is a planning study. It's really important. I think Darcy indicated that at the beginning when he introduced me, but it's really important to highlight that, and just we're looking at the development and testing of different options that we can consider to implement flood protection in Merritt. Related to that is from the engineering side, we want to come up with an opinion of probable cost. How much is this going to cost to build? And then ultimately, following this presentation and the open house tonight and some of the feedback that we get, in the coming days and maybe the next couple of weeks, we want to come up with what our preferred solution is and put that forward. So on the funding side, I have a couple slides here just to touch base on. It's really important just because of the scale of this project and the size of Merritt. We are going to need to seek external funding for this. So originally we were looking at going for the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. As I said, that's a federal program through Infrastructure Canada. It's a competitive program. The federal government put forward, I think, $2 billion, and then they added another $1.3 billion, so up to around $3.3, $3.4 billion available. There was 2 intakes. One was in November, and then one was supposed to be coming up in July. But we found out over the last couple of weeks that they have postponed that July intake. So that has had a little bit of an effect on sort of what direction we're going to be going, but I'll talk about that in a second.
Have they just postponed it, or have they canceled it?
The only information they have is that they've postponed it.
Okay.
And we did reach out and we got a generic response indicating that based on the November intake, there was an overwhelming amount of applications. So I think they're just taking their time to review those, and then maybe there's a political decision or a funding decision that they need to come up with. So all I can say right now is they say it's postponed.
Okay, thank you.
So very quickly, they have 2 scales, small scale and large scale. I'll present some costs at the very end of this presentation, and we're clearly going to fall into that large scale category. So that program has a merit-based criteria on how they evaluate the options. And you can read these here. I won't go through them all in detail, but whether it's through DMAF or some other funding mechanism, I think it's important that we do demonstrate some response to these types of criteria when we're putting forward an application or talking to the different levels of government about funding. So we have, since we found out about the potential postponement or delay with DMAF, we feel that we need to look hard at other potential funding sources. We've identified a couple here, and that may end up just being direct communication or coordination with different levels of government. But we just really want to highlight that there is going to be some funding urgency for Merritt to implement future flood mitigation. Okay, on to flood mitigation planning. So this particular slide just shows what we are currently working on, which is the summary on the left, and some of that text is a bit small, so I'll just describe it. And then the blue information on the right is the stuff that is still to come, which would be future work that isn't included right now. So clearly we've completed a fair amount of work over the last few months. So we've kicked the project off. We've been working on hydrology, coordinating with BGC Engineering, who's also supported on that. We've been looking at hydraulics, which is, again, the development and testing of these flood mitigation options, and then really getting into some of the planning elements. So our scope of work also included various assessments. We did an environmental overview, contaminated sites overview, archaeological overview. As I said, we were providing an opinion of probable costs. We're looking at multi-criteria analysis of the different options and how do we evaluate those and choose what our preferred option is. And then lastly, tonight is going to be our second open house, as well as the public survey that we completed, which I will say that public survey is still open and online for the residents to respond to.
Excuse me.
So the blue information on the right, so things that are still to come. So this would be submission of our plan to one or more levels of government to seek funding. And then once that's awarded, then we can get into the implementation stage, which will include working with property owners, as well as the detailed engineering design, permitting, environmental assessments, those types of things that need to happen before construction. So I just want to talk a little bit about watershed hydrology, and this is really important because it really sets the stage and defines the design criteria of what the flood mitigation program might look like. So we're all aware that there's two important rivers that flow through the city of Merritt. We have the Nicola River and the Coldwater River. The Nicola River is a much larger watershed. However, most of that flow from the Nicola watershed flows into Nicola Lake, which is dam controlled. So the outlet and the releases from the lake are definitely regulated and have an influence on spring freshet. So this particular watershed is what we call snowmelt dominated. So the peak flows occur right around this time actually, so May, June are typical when that snowmelt is occurring. The Coldwater, on the other hand, is a unique watershed. It's what we call a mixed regime. So it does have a freshet influence, so there is large flow events that can happen in the spring, so May, June. But then there also can be these atmospheric river events that are variable timing, but most commonly in the early winter period, so that November, December period, which is exactly what happened in November 15th last year. Just continuing on with hydrology, so there definitely is a flooding history in Merritt, and that flooding history is on both watersheds. So both the Coldwater and Nicola have had flood events in the past where the city has had to intervene and try and protect infrastructure and people. So we feel from an engineering perspective and a flood safety perspective that the flood mitigation plan definitely needs to consider risks of both river systems. So for the purposes of our study and the conceptual modeling that we completed, we define two peak or two design flow rates. So for the Nicola River, we're using a value of 130 cubic meters per second. And on the Coldwater River, we're using a value of 533 cubic meters per second. So again, this is for the concept purposes. There's still opportunity to evaluate these numbers, and before we get to detailed design and construction, we do have an opportunity to set potentially different design criteria, be it more or maybe even be it less. Yeah, so that's kind of the last bullet points there. So as I said at the beginning, there's a little bit of uncertainty as to what the published flow data point is going to be from Water Survey of Canada, and there also would be at least something that we would recommend consideration for watershed modeling as part of the detailed scope of work that could come in the future.
But even the Nicola is higher than what we usually have as a flow through the Nicola. Is that not right? Do we know, Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Your Worship. I would say that we've got a somewhat of a new regime with the Nicola River as we've worked towards management of that. And so historically, as in 5 years ago, 30 cubic meters was a high flow rate for the Nicola River, and we actually kind of thought that that was roughly where flooding occurs, whether it's through change of gauges or just much better understanding of what actual flow is. We now know that that level is closer to about 55 cubic meters. So we got to about 52 this year, and you can see that's high on us, but we've hit that level for 4 of our last 6 years now. We've seen some time where we've been up to that 52 cubes. In general, you can manage it by ramping it up faster and getting up to that higher flow rate than holding it, because you do have some element of control with the dam. But I would not in any way say that what we've seen this year is atypical for potential flows on the Nicola River.
Okay, thank you. Oh, you push it on, it blinks, and then when I move it, that's what you want.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Your Worship. So I'll just add on the Nicola River, the 130 value is, we did run statistical analysis on data from that river. And what I will say is that the dam is, based on the information that we have available, we understand that the 2 radial gates from that dam have the ability to have an outflow of 130 cubic meters per second. So for engineering design, at least for this concept study, that's what we've used. But as I said, both of these values can be adjusted at the next step when we get into the detailed portion. So this is just a one slide on hydraulics, but I can't understate the importance of this. This is really the meat of the work that we've been doing. So we use a software called HECRAS, and we were provided a base model from BGC Engineering. We've adapted that model, as I say, to develop and test various scenarios and different alignments and different options of flood protection. All of the concepts that I'm going to present to you were modeled, and what we mean by that is we have the topography, the land surface in Merritt, and we can actually physically, or not physically, but conceptually stamp those dike features in and then rerun the model to test and see how the river responds and just really look at the evaluation of how that hydraulic system performs. So various types of flood protection structures, and before I get into some of these, I just want to highlight that in BC there is a piece of legislation called the Dike Maintenance Act, and I think most people would perceive a dike to be your typical earthen embankment beside of a river, but that's actually not the case. So there's a whole list of structures here. I won't read them all, but essentially any type of structure that is installed to prevent flooding of land is considered a dike under the Act. So that's just a really important point to flag here. So I'll show a few different typical cross sections, and in this particular view we have the river on the left hand side of the image, and then the land would be on the right. So this is what we call a waterside dike or waterside embankment dike. So we have that earth structure separating the land from the river. And these would be placed right on the bank of the river, which is what we have in place right now today in Merritt in some locations. Very similar to that is what we call setback embankment dikes. So we have that same structure, but now we take it and we slide it away from the riverbank. And how far away can be dependent on a number of different factors, but this type of setback dike feature allows for flooding onto a floodplain, and which has a lot of benefits, and is just another type of feature that can be considered for flood protection. But in doing so in locations where there are properties immediately beside the river, this has impacts that need to be evaluated. And I just want to go over sort of the geometry of what a modern dike would look like. So we can see here various iterations of raising a dike structure. And in the bold image at the very front, we have a 2-meter high dike, which would have a 4-meter high or 4-meter wide top. That 4-meter width is standard. That's sort of typical for dike structures, which would be necessary for operation and maintenance, but also provide that ancillary function of an active transportation corridor, for instance, or just a pathway for people to use. So if it was a 2-meter high dike, that would take up at least 12 meters. So every meter that we go up for flood protection, now we're adding another 4 meters. So in this particular image, if we had a 5-meter high dike, the width or the land requirement for that would be 24 meters. What's also not shown here is there's a requirement from the province for dike structures to have a right-of-way behind that dike structure of an additional, I think, 7 or 8 meters. So when you consider existing properties that are along a river and we look at this geometry just from a conceptual perspective, that's a lot of space that we need to build these types of dikes.
And the riverbed is not necessarily anywhere near the bottom of that first piece.
Yeah, not necessarily. You're right.
On the land level.
Yep. Yeah, we could slide that left or right, but yeah, that weighs into the amount of land required. That's right. So another alternative form of a dike structure is a sheet pile dike, or we could call it a narrow dike if it was another form of a wall system. So in some locations where we have limited space or complicated areas, we can consider this alternative. In most situations, this type of structure is going to be more expensive than an earth embankment, and it's also harder to own and maintain over the long term. And in addition, because we now have property on the back side of the sheet pile, we're isolating the river. And as we saw from the public survey, there's a lot of value for the residents to have that access. So these types of systems, although they're used in some situations, they can have an effect of isolating the river from the city. So this wouldn't be a dike, but there could be many locations where we just consider erosion and scour protection. So this is going to be your typical rock riprap that we would place right on the bank to protect areas that are prone to instability or those types of things. So we don't need to have an elevation requirement in this particular example, but it still provides that function of protection. So other types of flood protection structures we could consider, there's road raising, which we could call a wide dike. So that in some instances we can raise the elevation or the profile of a road to provide that same function as a dike structure. Drainage pump stations, which are likely going to be considered in Merritt because when we build these linear features along the river or set back from the river, now we're cutting off that overland drainage route. So when it rains in the city, now that water has nowhere to go. So we, in some instances, we do have to consider pumping that water out. Bridge replacements is definitely tied to this. It's not necessarily a flood protection structure in and of itself, but when we have dikes that are coming up to these road crossings and we potentially have flagged deficiencies or capacity issues with some of the existing bridges, now we have to start looking at that as well. One of the things that we saw from the commentary portion of the public survey, and a lot of people did comment on this, was the issue or the idea of dredging the Coldwater River. And so I'll talk about that on the next slide a little bit further, but we did have the benefit of having some recent survey data on pre-event and post-event. And so I'm showing two graphs here. So the lighter dashed line is the pre-event at particular locations, and then the darker solid line is what was measured actually just this spring, so after the event. And there was a lot of comments saying that the river filled up with a lot of sediment, and I would agree with that in some locations. There were some areas where there was deposition, but there's also other locations where it was very evident there was a lot of erosion and the river actually downcut. So it's a bit of a balance there, but yeah, it's just not widespread. I think there's perhaps a bit of perception that the whole river system just filled up with sediment, and that just doesn't seem to be the case by the data that we have. So just some commentary on river channel dredging. So this wouldn't be considered a flood protection structure. This wouldn't be a dike. Sediment removal can be used as a management tool, and in some instances there are cases where that is done. But we consider it a temporary measure, and it would require ongoing work. And that has costs associated with it to do that periodically. But dredging in general, that can actually cause adverse impacts in other locations. So we can actually destabilize banks. We can cause erosion in other locations. And perhaps one of the most important things is when we do channel dredging, there's a loss in habitat. And sometimes that can actually be permanent loss in habitat. As I said, this can be expensive, and when we consider the length of the Coldwater River or the Nicola, but particularly the Coldwater River flowing through Merritt, that's a lot of area to dredge on a periodic basis.
And if it's not a flood protection structure, there's probably not a whole lot of funding out there for it. That would be my guess.
I think that's fair, yes. I think I would agree with that. Yep. So it may not be a practical solution. I think it can be considered in some locations, and I'll show that on the maps in a second. But it may not be a sustainable solution over the long term. And lastly, there's regulatory agencies that may discourage this type of management option. Okay, so let's get into the conceptual options that we've looked at. So we have 6 options that we'll show you. We've listed them here. So option 1 is status quo. Option 2 is a full retreat from the floodplain. Option 3 is what we're calling waterside diking. And then option 4, so we have 4A, 4B, 4C. These are combination diking, so we have waterside and setback. And again, I'll just reiterate that these are conceptual level for planning purposes, for evaluation of different options, and we're using them as a tool to seek funding for implementation at a later stage. I'll also say that the first 2 options kind of set the bounds. So status quo is do nothing, and that's likely not a solution we're going to consider, but we're including it in this list. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the full retreat from the floodplain. And as you'll see in a second, that has severe consequences, and it's also likely not a solution we'll consider. So we're weeding it down to 3 and then the various 4s. So here's essentially a floodplain map with depths showing option 1, which is status quo, do nothing. This isn't that different from what Merritt actually experienced in November.
Is this our 200-year, or is this a new and improved floodplain?
So this is on both river systems, those numbers that I gave earlier. So on the Nicola, this is the 130.
Okay.
And on the Coldwater, this is the 533.
Okay.
So it's a great question, because the flood inundation results are going to be directly tied to whatever input we put into the model. But as you can see here, similar to what happened in November 21, there's a lot of risks to people and properties with the current situation. There's a substantial amount of overland flooding that can escape both river systems and go into the developed parts of the city. So option 2 is essentially showing the same flood inundation extents, but now we've overlaid the properties that have the most impact from the flooding. So those are shaded in red. And in fact, there's now over 1,400 properties that we've identified as being impacted. So a full retreat from the floodplain would have very severe consequences for Merritt. So this is option 3, waterside diking. So this would be the first sort of structural or first sort of engineered option, and maybe a bit difficult for everyone to see, but essentially we've placed conceptual dike structures along the riverbanks in most locations to mitigate that overland flooding and constrain that water to the natural river or to the current river channel. What we see in the model results from doing this type of concept is basically we're confining the river channel. So in these types of situations, we're usually going to have fairly deep or higher water elevations compared to the option 4s that I'll show you in a second.
How does that affect downstream?
Downstream of Merritt. So our model extents are limited spatially, so we're upstream of Merritt just to the downstream boundary. So we haven't actually modeled anything further down, but even in this particular map that you can see here, at the downstream end of the dike, so downstream of the wastewater infiltration ponds, as soon as we end that dike, water now starts to overtop under these types of flood conditions. So what we would probably see, and I'm just speculating at this stage, but because we have this constrained river system flowing through the city, there might be some sediment impacts or erosion impacts that could occur downstream. But that is something that we'd have to investigate a little bit further. So this is the first of the 3 different combinations. And again, the scale of these maps on the screens in front of you may be a bit hard to see, but what we're testing in these 4A, 4B, 4C is placing dike structures in slightly different locations near or just set back from the river, and seeing how the river responds and how that water elevation responds to come up with a solution that we think is going to be feasible to build. So 4B, slightly different than 4A, again, just placing dikes in different locations, but having that setback element. And I will say, we do have these as large poster boards, so if you're coming to the open house, you can browse them a little bit in more detail and be happy to answer more questions. And then lastly, 4C. So again, I apologize at this scale, you may not be able to tell the difference, but we can talk about that in detail later tonight. So I just want to highlight a few of the more challenging areas for flood protection, just from a technical perspective. As we've gone through this, we've identified a few areas that are going to be perhaps just have more constraints, more limitations on designing flood protection. So this first corridor is on the Nicola River, so Bott Street, 1st Avenue, and 2nd Avenue. We've identified that the bridge may not have enough capacity for this level of flow, and in doing so, if we look at bridge replacement, road raising, now we have driveways and intersections that need to be changed. There's some pretty challenging areas. We also have Lions Memorial Park. So coming up with a scheme that's effective and has limited impacts on property in this particular location is going to have some challenges. Just downstream of there, still on the Nicola River, is the corridor with the golf course, El Dorado Park. We have Highway 8. Similarly, this bridge, which we understand is owned by the ministry, is also potentially undersized. So, this is also a complicated corridor with different jurisdictions here. So, there's some tough decisions that need to happen along this area. And then the last one, which is going to be no surprise to anyone, is the sort of the downstream end of the Coldwater River. So starting at Main Street Bridge, again, another bridge that is probably undersized. We have the properties immediately north of the bridge. There's the sewer lift station just on the other side of the river. The properties that were damaged on Pine Street, the wastewater ponds, the gas main. There's a lot going on in this area. So looking at options of flood protection, there's going to be a lot of considerations here. So here's a summary table, and I won't read all the text. Again, this is also going to be available on one of our large poster boards this evening at the open house. But we've laid out the different options. So we have status quo, which is do nothing. We have a full retreat from the floodplain. We have waterside diking, and then lastly we have various combinations of waterside and setback diking. There's going to be various levels of property impacts to any of these options, or variants of these options for that matter. And what we've done is put together an opinion of probable costs for each of these options, and you can see there at the bottom that these are substantial numbers that we're looking at. If we do nothing, and another flood event happens in November or next freshet, we're estimating that there could be damages and costs in the around $500 million in that range. So we've estimated $445 to $580 million. Option 2, which is the most expensive option, which is probably not surprising if we look at retreating entirely from the floodplain. Obviously there's large amount of properties to consider, and then restoration of all that area. So we have a very high number associated with this. So 587 million to 764. The waterside diking option, we're estimating that the cost for that could be in the range of 135 to 176 million. And then the various options 4A, 4B, 4C, 121 to 168 million. And so there's a lot that goes into these, our opinion of probable costs. We just want to highlight that it is a Class D for planning purposes, and there is a contingency built into that. But again, these are big values that we're looking at for implementation. So this is my last slide before I send it back to Darcy and Greg. So we've looked at 6 conceptual options. We can still evaluate these options and refine them as needed based on input from the city and the public. So we don't have a preferred option just yet, but the costs of this are going to be high, and funding is going to be necessary. So we can also consider a phasing of a multi-year program, and considering we're working in water, that's going to be necessary anyway, because you're not going to be able to build this scale of a program in one season. So the next steps, once funding is secured, I mean, the funding is the biggest priority right now, but once that is secured, we can start working with the property owners in the dike and setback areas, and then we can get into the details of design, permitting, further environmental assessments, and then eventually into construction. So thank you for your time.
Are there any questions from council at this point? Doesn't look like any, so I'm going to turn it back to Darcy.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, if there's no further questions, our next steps essentially for this program will be to incorporate the feedback we received from yourselves, as well as from the community engagement session this evening, and then also take any additional survey results to then put together essentially a funding proposal, and then to seek out funding for this program of work. We did also invite the First Nations representatives to join. They were not able to, but from Chief Arnold Lempro with the Shakin Indian Band, he had a statement he'd like me to read. He just said, when the city of Merritt went down, we lost a second home. We felt displaced again. As a chief, he supports the city of Merritt and Mayor Linda Brown, and advocate to other agencies on behalf of the city of Merritt, and he just said that we're all hurting. All that to say is I do certainly appreciate your time and attention this afternoon, and we'll look forward to engaging with you later on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have a message into Minister Blair to find out if this is postponed or if there's another fund we can access or a combination of. He hasn't gotten back to me, but I will continue to call until he does get back to me. So I don't know what we're looking at this point in terms of funding pot, but thank you, both of you. And back to Greg now.
Yeah, thanks, Your Worship. I just wanted to thank everybody on behalf of the team and all the work that everyone's done here. Really appreciate it. And also, well, everybody that's here, thanks for all your support. It's made it easier on everyone for what we've seen from the support from admin and from council. Thanks.
It's a huge job. I mean, we haven't even started yet and it feels overwhelming, but yeah, I know we've started. I shouldn't say that. We have started. We're not just sitting around doing nothing, but there's a long ways to go yet. And it's, yeah, that's just us. We haven't done the, as you mentioned, the downstream or the upstream. It's not our area, but yeah, I'm a little overwhelmed with how much work we have left to do. But I don't have to do it. You guys are helping do it. So, yeah, you put in the hard work, and
You're the chair of the finding $120 million.
yeah, you know what? I can do. What you do, I'm absolutely overwhelmed. I couldn't even attempt to do it, but yes, I can talk to the ministers, no question. So we can find that. So thank you. Council is very appreciative of what you have done for the city of Merritt, and we just can't thank you enough. So thank you. And we'll see you at the town hall tonight.
Yes, thank you.